Hi, welcome to this really short lecture looking at another of New Labour's education policy, the Academies policy. I'm going to look at telling you a bit more about these schools today, how they were set up, so you're really clear in terms of a definition of what they are. And then I'm going to set you up with an activity to evaluate them. Just so you're all clear what they are, academies are publicly funded schools. So the money for them mainly comes from central government, okay? But they operate outside of local authority control. So, for example, they are not in any way linked to the local authority, which is normally, the county. So it might be East Sussex in our case. Academies do not have to follow the national curriculum, and they can choose their own curriculum as long as it's broad and balanced. However, they now do need to do the English, maths, science, so that kind of got changed a bit later on. But they can be very flexible with the other subjects. And based on this quote that you can see on this slide, it says from Blair, ask me my three main priorities for government and I tell you education, education, education. We are the 35th in the World League of Education Standards, 35th. At every level, radical improvement and reform. Now, when he's talking about that World League, he's talking about the PISA tables, okay? And I want to draw your attention to that. Purely because the Academies programme was a very new idea in the UK, the idea of getting private companies involved in sponsoring and running schools. And this idea was adopted from what was known as charter schools that had been implemented in America. However, there's no way that New Labour would have done any of these reforms if it hadn't been for that PISA league table position. So Academies is also a useful policy because it shows clearly the evidence of the influence of globalisation on educational policy in the UK, because it was a reaction against the low PISA position, and we copied a policy from America as well. Anyway, so let me just talk to you a little bit more about academies, or what I sort of call old style academies that were known as sponsorship academies. So these were introduced by New Labour. Roughly around 200 schools were converted to these this type of an academy, sometimes known as a sponsorship academy. The idea was that failing schools were taken out of local authority control and they were put into the hands of mainly private companies, or partnerships at least with private companies. So you end up with these public/private organisations, somewhere in between being private and yet still publicly funded. Now, these were mainly private companies took on the running of these academy chains. However, there were some charity groups, universities also took over the running of some schools. Again, for each of these organisations, they would have made their money back on their investment, okay? So universities are private companies, if you like, they have to make money. And these organisations, they invested, resources and money and expertise in these schools. They also helped build these brand new schools, and they made use of an enormous pot of government funding to build these brand new schools. Okay, and there's an example there of quite a flashy new build on this slide, very different to your traditional sort of secondary school that perhaps hasn't had a whole lot of money spent on it for a number of years. I'm not mentioning any names. Now, like I mentioned, these organisations would have all had returns on their investment through the funding formula itself. So the more students they get through the door, the more money those schools get. Okay, so they want to attract as many students as possible. They're still incentivised by that. And they can kind of spend the money how they want because they're not controlled by local authority. They're not even properly controlled by government. They kind of report into a board of executives, a private company. And many of them who did help with the building of schools, they actually rented those schools back to either the local authority or the government for a school to operate out of that building. Okay, so that's kind of how old academies were set up. They were a great idea, and they really did inject a load of cash and a load of resources to schools that well needed it. Okay, and we saw quite significant improvement in many of those schools. Just so you're aware, because I keep saying old style academies, The new style academies from 2010 onwards were introduced by the coalition government that was led by the Conservative Party. They were in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats from 2010 to 2015. And they changed the criteria for becoming an academy. They said actually now all schools could become academies, mainly successful schools, both in terms of league table position and Ofsted reports, could now become academies, which, if you like, kind of stopped this policy being a compensatory policy, because it meant that even the best schools could now get access to extra funding. So it no longer was compensatory from that point onwards. So my job for you guys then, I'd like you to explain in your notes how are old academies, the sponsorship academies, how is it a compensatory education policy? How does it compensate for educational disadvantage? And secondly, what evidence is there of neoliberalism, okay, the neoliberal ideology in the influence of educational policy? And this one is predominantly the influence of privatisation, okay? And finally, I would like you to read a short article from 2007, and I've chosen quite an old article because I want it to talk about the old academies, not the current academies that are dominant. What are the concerns about academies that have been identified in that article? I'll send you the link, and I'll send you the article if I can. If for whatever reason you haven't got that, you can scan the QR code that's on this slide to take you to that article in The Guardian. Okay, so I'd like you to read that article, and I'd like you to make a list of the concerns mainly identified in that article. But I would also like you to try and come up with 3, maybe 4 positives about these academies and what was good about them. It's easy to sort of slate government policy. It can be sometimes more difficult to find the strengths, but they are definitely there for this policy. So I'd like you to have a list of, the concerns based on that article and anything else you might find out. But also I want you to have a note of at least 3 or 4 strengths of this policy. Great. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.